In this segment, we'll consider evidence for H that comes from history, that is, evidence for the claim that violence is part of human nature that comes from human history, specifically the history of war. So here's the basic idea. History is full of warfare. If that's right, then violence is part of human nature. Therefore, violence is part of human nature. Here's the form of Zinn's rebuttal. He denies premise 2. He says that he doesn't think the amount of warfare that there has been in history shows that violence is part of human nature. His argument here is fairly complex, so I'm going to set it out in a clear way. So this is his argument. History being full of warfare implies that violence is part of human nature only if the following conditions hold. 1. The best explanation for nations entering war, or for soldiers entering war, is that those soldiers have an innate drive toward violence, or that the population has an innate drive towards violence. Or condition 2 is met, that war is ubiquitous. Then he says, well, the decision of nations to enter war is not best explained by citizens' innate drive toward violence, nor is the decision of soldiers to enter war best explained by their innate drive towards violence. So that condition 1 in premise 2 subscript 1 doesn't hold. He then asserts that war isn't ubiquitous, so condition 2 in premise 2 subscript 1 doesn't hold. So then by modus tollens, the argument form that says if P implies Q and we learn that Q is false, then we know that P is false, we can conclude that history being full of warfare doesn't imply that violence is part of human nature. And that directly counters 2 in the premise for the claim that violence is part of human nature that's based on human history. Okay, so now let's go through and consider why Zinn accepts these premises. We're not going to say anything about premise 1. Premise 1 doesn't require defense, and the reason it doesn't require defense is this. People who advocate the claim at issue, that is, the claim that if history is full of warfare, then violence is part of human nature, advocate it precisely because they accept that something like 2 subscript 1 is true. Since they accept that 2 subscript 1 is true, Zinn's interlocutors, the people he's having a conversation with, in this case the people whom he's criticizing, already accept this premise, so this will not be a point of dispute. If there is a point of dispute, it's going to be 2 subscript 2, 2 subscript 3, or 2 subscript 4. So Zinn feels an obligation to provide reason to believe those. So let's start with 2 subscript 2. Here's what Zinn has to say. Remember, 2 subscript 2 says the decision of nations to enter war is not best explained by citizens' innate drive toward violence, and his interlocutors will object to this claim. So why does he think it's true? He says, this is a quote, "Are there not persistent facts about human society that can explain the constant eruption of war without recourse to those mysterious instincts that science, however hard it tries, cannot find in our genes? Is not one of those facts about human society the existence of ruling elites in every culture who become enamored of their own power and seek to extend it?" So he's saying that there's an alternative explanation for why nations go to war. And one alternative explanation is this, that there are ruling elites in various governments. And those ruling elites who have expanded their power over the entire domestic population want to extend it further to include foreign populations or the resources of foreign populations. Zinn continues, "Is not another of those facts that can explain why there's war the greed, not of the general population, but of powerful minorities in society who seek more raw materials or more markets or more land or more favorable places for investment? Here you might think of, for example, various wars in which, say, corporations or a small minority of members of government who have an interest in certain corporations lead the government to attack a foreign government or a portion of a foreign government where there are resources that could help those corporations." He continues, Is there not a persistent ideology of nationalism, especially in the modern world, a set of beliefs taught to each generation in which the motherland or the fatherland is an object of veneration and becomes a burning cause for which one becomes willing to kill the children of other motherlands or fatherlands? And here what he's doing in effect, he doesn't put it this way, and I don't think he's exactly thinking this way, but what he's doing in effect is saying, don't we develop in-group bias in favor of our members of our own nation and out-group bias against members of other nations? So we think very differently about the people in our nation and those in other nations. And because we think so differently about the people in our nation versus other nations, it becomes easy to whip us into a frenzy, to prepare us for war, to encourage us toward war, because we think the other nations are guilty of various crimes or deserve what they're getting because they're somehow worse than us or more dangerous than us. Okay, so just real quick before we go on to the next one, the basic idea here is that there are many explanations for why nations enter war that don't appeal to an innate drive towards violence in the population. And in fact, Zinn also talks about specific historical cases. For example, in World War I, the population was very much against the war. Woodrow Wilson, prior to World War I, prior to the U.S. entry into World War I, I should say, won his election partly by promising not to enter the U.S. into World War I. Once he achieved power and became president, he decided, partly to dictate the terms of peace, that he wanted to enter World War I. And he then had to go about convincing the population to enter the war. Well, if the best explanation for that war was citizens' innate drive towards violence, he wouldn't have had to run on an anti-war ticket to win, and he wouldn't have had to then convince the general population to go to war, which he did through extensive propaganda campaigns, hiring, among many others, academics to give speeches in favor of the war without revealing that they were paid shills for the government, creating something called the Ministry of Public Information, which was basically a propaganda center run out of the federal government to try and persuade people that the war was a good idea, and so on and so forth. None of that fits with the claim that an innate drive towards violence on part of the population was the cause of the U.S. entering that war. It rather fits with the kind of reasons that Zinn offers here. Okay, what about 2 subscript 3, the claim that the decisions of soldiers to enter war is not best explained by their innate drive toward violence? Now, this again is the claim in Zinn's argument, and his opponents would reject this claim. So why does he think it's true? Well, we'll look at 2 kinds of considerations he offers in favor of it. First, when you look at modern war, he says, do you find men rushing into it with a ferocious desire to kill? Hardly. You find men, and some women, joining the armed forces in search of training, careers, companionship, glamour, and psychological and economic security. You find others being conscripted by law. Now, this hasn't happened recently, but it happened during, for example, the Vietnam War and World War II, under penalty of prison if they refuse. And all of them suddenly transported into a war where the habit of following orders and the dinning into their ears of the tightness of their cause can overcome the fear of death or the moral scruples of murdering another human being. So what Zinn is saying here is pretty straightforward. If humans' innate drive towards violence best explained soldiers entering war, then it would be really easy to get people to join up to go to war. And if it was really easy to get people to join up to go to war, you wouldn't need conscription. Well, we needed conscription for World War I, World War II, the Vietnam War, the Korean War. That is, people didn't voluntarily, some people did, but many, many people didn't voluntarily enter these wars. Even people who thought these wars were good wars often didn't voluntarily enter the wars. They only entered the wars because the government compelled them to. Well, if people just wanted to go to war, they go to war because it's an excuse to be violent, then you wouldn't need conscription. More generally, he's saying that there's a variety of reasons people do join, even when they do so voluntarily. People join the military sometimes not during wartime, expecting not to go to war. Or even if they join during war, it may not be to let out their aggressive impulses, but rather because they want training or careers or economic security. The point, again, is that there's very little evidence that soldiers join the military or more generally go to war. People become soldiers or more generally go to war because it allows their innate drive for violence to be exercised. That's Zinn's point. Zinn also gives some personal evidence in favor of this claim that the decision of soldiers to enter war is not best explained by their innate drive towards violence. And here's a quote. He says, "We had been brought up to believe that our political leaders had good motives and could be trusted to do right in the world. We had learned that the world had good guys and bad guys, good countries and bad countries, and ours was good. We had been trained to fly planes, fire guns, operate bomb sites, and to take pride in doing the job well." Now he's saying we here because he's describing himself. He volunteered for World War II, for the military during World War II, and became a decorated bombardier. "And we had been trained to follow orders, which there was no good reason to question, because everyone on our side was good and on the other side bad." So he's emphasizing here that he's trained to think in this way. And notice it's not especially hard to train people to think well of their own group and poorly of other groups. Remember the evidence that we went through dealing with outgroup biases. "Besides," he says, "we didn't have to watch a little girl's legs blown off by our bombs. We were 30,000 feet high and no human being on the ground was visible. No scream could be heard. Surely that is enough to explain how men can participate in war. We don't have to grope in the darkness of human nature." Okay. The next premise in the argument is that war isn't ubiquitous, meaning war isn't omnipresent. We're not always at war. And here the evidence is very simple. That is, the evidence in favor of this claim is very simple. There are nations that never go to war. There are nations that are officially neutral. And even for those that sometimes do go to war, many enjoy long periods of peace. So, to recap, here's Zinn's argument. The first premise of the argument is this: history being full of warfare implies that violence is part of human nature only if the best explanation for nations entering war or soldiers entering war is that they have an innate drive toward violence, or if war is ubiquitous. But the decision of nations to enter war is not best explained by citizens' innate drive towards violence, and the decision of soldiers to enter war is not best explained by their innate drive towards violence, and war isn't ubiquitous. So, he thinks he's supported these claims, so by modus tollens, history being full of warfare doesn't imply that violence is part of human nature. That is, 2 in the argument from history is false. So if we go back to the argument from history, the argument says history is full of warfare, and that implies that violence is part of human nature, that there's a wide range of circumstances in which humans will regularly behave violently towards one another, and a narrow range in which they won't, given our nature. But, says Zinn, the amount of warfare that's actually in history and various social factors that explain those wars block premise 2. So, he thinks, the argument from history is no good. Now notice that there's just a dashed line through psychology because Zinn has knocked down the experiment that's most commonly taken to support the claim that violence is part of human nature, that is Milgram's experiment on punishment. Similar results you'd get for the Stanford prison experiment. But there are other experiments that do show that there are aspects of human nature that certainly can contribute to our going to war, such as it's plausible that outgroup and in-group biases are inbuilt. Okay, so remember that Hobbes thinks that a disposition to behave violently is part of human nature. Zinn disagrees. We framed this dispute as a dispute about a particular proposition we were calling H. H holds that in the absence of authority and the fear of punishment, there is a wide range of circumstances in which a large majority of people will behave violently towards one another. So remove authority and a fear of punishment, we're going to behave violently towards one another. But there's a narrow range of circumstances in which even a significant minority of humans won't behave violently towards one another. And what Zinn claims is that there's no evidence for this claim. Now, Someone might say, for example, that humans' history of warfare provides evidence for this claim. But Zinn says, no, if human history of warfare provide evidence for this claim, war would be more common. Soldiers, everyone would volunteer to be a soldier, or at least most people would, because when you're a soldier, the fear of punishment is removed for being violent is removed. You have an excuse to be violent. But in fact, most people don't volunteer to go to war. If this were true, then in the Milgram experiment, in any variation of the experiment even those where you're given freedom to choose your shock levels, you would shock people as severely as possible because an authority figure is removing the fear of punishment. There is no authority figure to punish, but people don't behave especially violently in the Milgram experiment when they're free to choose their own shock levels. And even when they're not, even when they're being told by an authority to choose maximum shock levels or high shock levels, about a third of people, a little more than a third of people, deviate and refuse. And Zinn more generally goes through a wide range of kinds of claims people have invoked to support H and knocks them down. And that's the end of this section.